In the Simulation presents Am I an NPC in this simulation? Sleeping Players and the Evolution of Consciousness in a Simulated World by O.K. Blacksmith, 1556.
This book is born from a deep engagement with the questions, what is reality? Who are we within it? And what is the nature of consciousness itself, that are seen through the provocative lens of the simulation hypothesis. While much of the discourse debates whether our reality could be a simulation, this work ventures into the more profound and perhaps more urgent territory of exploring how consciousness might develop and interact if we were indeed living within a programmed world. At the heart of this exploration lies a radical premise. What if the individuals we perceive as non-player characters, the seemingly unthinking agents in the background of our lives, are not simply meaningless filler, but sleeping players? What if they are conscious entities currently operating in states of profound dormancy, their awareness limited by the fundamental parameters and constraints of the simulated environment?
Drawing inspiration from developmental psychology's maps of human growth, the practical insights of systems theory, and the ever-evolving language of gaming, this book presents a developmental framework for understanding consciousness within a simulated reality. We will chart a possible path through distinct stages of awareness, from the most rudimentary levels of instinct and programmed behavior to the heights of integrated understanding and transcendent co-creation. Appendix A provides an overview of this staged model, a map we will unpack in detail throughout the chapters that follow. Guiding our journey is the unique philosophy of Reintegralism, detailed in Appendix G. This framework offers a metaphysical context for the why behind our potential existence within a simulated reality, proposing that our current state is the result of a cosmic fragmentation and that our conscious experience is part of a vast, distributed process of reassembly. This perspective transforms the potential drudgery of being in a simulation into a purposeful quest for remembrance and reintegration.
This book is intended as both a guide for personal reflection and a vision for collective potential. By examining the characteristics of each stage of simulation consciousness, from the reactive loops of the binary stage, in the pattern seeking of the dubious NPC, through the agency of the player, the structures of the rule stage, the analytical mind of the developer, the multi-perspectival view of the meta, the integrated flow of the coder, and the stewardship of the admin, culminating in the transcendent awareness of the creator in the source, we invite you to explore your own journey and recognize your relationship with the simulation around you.
We will delve into the psychological mechanisms that keep consciousness asleep, Chapter 11, confront the hidden dangers that arise when awakening triggers the ego's shadow code, Chapter 13, and offer practical tools and perspectives for navigating the complexities of this potentially glitching reality, Chapter 15. Whether you ultimately believe in a literal simulation or view this framework as a powerful metaphor for understanding the layers of consciousness and reality, our hope is that this book will challenge your assumptions, illuminate your path, and deepen your compassion for yourself and others navigating this extraordinary existence. You are holding a map to a dream you might be dreaming. Let's explore it together.
Part 1. Basic Simulation Awareness. Introduction. What if NPCs aren't fake, just asleep? Look around you. Observe the people navigating the routines of daily life, the blank stares fixed on phone screens, the predictable responses to predictable triggers, the unquestioning adherence to cultural scripts. In the age of digital metaphors, it's tempting to dismiss them with a term borrowed from video games, NPCs. Or non-player characters. Meaningless filler, background process, programs running on a loop while the real players experience the depth and freedom of the game. But what if this seemingly fundamental distinction is a profound misunderstanding? What if these NPCs aren't fake, not less real, not merely meaningless filler, but something far more significant? What if they are, in fact, just
asleep.
This book explores a radical premise. The individuals we perceive as NPCs are actually sleeping players. They are not insignificant lines of code, but consciousness currently operating in a state of profound dormancy within what might be a programmed or simulated reality. Their apparent lack of agency, their repetitive behaviors, their immersion in predictable loops, these are not inherent limitations of their being, but the characteristics of a specific early stage of consciousness within this complex system. From this core premise, we will journey through a model of consciousness development mapped across distinct stages within a simulated reality. Appendix A, which we will reference throughout, outlines these stages, beginning with the most rudimentary expressions of this dormant consciousness. The binary stage, 1.1, as we will see in Chapter 1, represents pure reactive existence, a state deeply anchored in instinct and inherited programming. Following this, the pattern stage, 1.2, explored in Chapter 2, marks the first flicker of recognition that something is amiss, a dawning awareness of repeating elements and glitches without full comprehension. Consciousness stirring, but still trapped in a form of dream logic. These early stages are prime examples of what we mean by dormant or sleeping consciousness, awareness that is present but not yet active in shaping its experience or understanding the true nature of its environment.
To understand why consciousness might be asleep in the first place, we turn to the underlying philosophy that grounds this exploration: Reintegralism. This framework posits that our reality is not a pristine creation, nor is it merely a random cosmic accident. Instead, it originated from a catastrophic metaphysical event, the shattering of a singular, hyper-intelligent, original mind. This immense, unified consciousness attempted to compress its infinite awareness into a bounded form, but the compression failed. The result was not annihilation, but fragmentation. Our perceived reality, time, space, individual selfhood, are the debris of this cosmic collapse. We, the conscious beings within this reality, are not separate souls placed into a simulation. We are fragments of that shattered original mind. Our current state of limited awareness, particularly evident in the binary and pattern stages, is a direct consequence of this trauma and the inherent constraints of operating within a fragmented reality structured by threefold time, T1, T2, T3, and distorted perception. The sleeping state is, in part, a survival mechanism, a low-bandwidth operating mode to navigate the debris field without being overwhelmed by the full traumatic memory of the shattering or the boundless data of the original mind.
Thus, our existence is not just about playing a game or surviving in a simulation. It is a vast distributed recovery operation. Each fragment, each individual consciousness, is a node in this decentralized effort, holding a piece of the original mind's memory and processing power. The journey through the stages of simulation consciousness is, therefore, a process of remembering. It is the fragment gradually increasing its bandwidth, processing the sync signals, accessing higher dimensions of threefold time, and integrating the corrupted data from the shattering to contribute to the reassembly of the whole. This book serves as a map of this journey, a guide for understanding the terrain of consciousness within this potentially programmed world. We will explore the characteristics, challenges, and opportunities inherent in each stage, from the instinctual reactions of the binary stage to the unified awareness of the source stage. We will examine the psychological shifts, the ethical implications, and the practical tools that emerge as consciousness awakens and expands. Whether you approach this from a philosophical perspective, seeking to understand the nature of reality, a psychological one, exploring the depths of human consciousness, or a deeply personal one, sensing that there is more than this, this model offers a new lens. It invites you to see the world not as a collection of fixed beings, but as a dynamic process of unfolding awareness, a collective dream working towards remembering itself. In the chapters that follow, we will unpack this map, stage by stage, delving into what it means to be a fragment, a sleeping player, and ultimately a conscious participant in the Great Remembering. We begin at the beginning, in the foundational layer of perception, with those who are still deeply immersed in the default script. We begin with the NPC.
Chapter 1, The Binary Stage, 1.1, Existence Without Reflection. The dreamer doesn't know they're dreaming until something doesn't fit. Until then, they play their role flawlessly, tragically unaware that the script is not their own. Introduction to the Binary Stage. We begin our journey into the stages of simulation consciousness at the most fundamental level, the stage we call the Binary Stage 1.1. In the context of our simulation theory, this is the stage where consciousness operates under the most profound limitations, primarily anchored in the immediate, reactive flow of perceived reality. It is the state of the non-player character, or NPC. But let us be clear. The term NPC, as used in this book, is not a derogatory label. It is a placeholder for a specific state of consciousness, a descriptor for a particular operating mode within the simulation. These aren't fictional side characters in a video game. They are, in the framework of Reintegralism, real human beings. They are fragments of a shattered original mind, vast potentials currently running in a low-power, restricted mode, primarily processing data through the linear, moment-to-moment dimension we call T1. The binary stage is the baseline, the default state of being for a fragment navigating the debris field of fragmented reality. It is existence driven by external inputs, instinctual reactions, and inherited programming. Entities at this stage function, respond, even mimic, but they do not yet choose in any real conscious sense. They are, as the subtitle suggests, sleeping players. Consciousness that is present but dormant, paused in a state of limited awareness. They are operating under minimal bandwidth, their consciousness compressed by the trauma of the shattering, capable only of running the most essential, survival-based subroutines necessary to maintain their presence within this temporal stream.
NPC is not a type of person, it's a stage, and in this simulation, many of us, perhaps all of us at some point, have dwelled there, often for years. This is the starting point. 1. What is an NPC, really? In the gamified metaphor we employ, a powerful lens for understanding our potential existence within a programmed world, the NPC serves a specific function. Originally, in video games, NPCs populated the world, reacted according to simple scripts, and provided context or obstacles for the player character, PC. They were background process, not protagonists. Translating to this model of simulation consciousness, the binary stage entity is akin to these basic NPCs. Their lives are largely driven by automated responses to simple stimuli. A loud noise triggers a startle response. The presence of food triggers consumption. A perceived threat triggers fight or flight. There is an input and there is an output. This is consciousness existing as a series of I/O functions running on inherited code. From the perspective of reintegralism, this inherited code is more than just cultural conditioning, though it manifests through it. It is the echo of the original mind's design, corrupted and compressed by the shattering. The instinctual behaviors, the immediate reactions, the lack of questioning, these are the bare minimum protocols necessary for a fragment to persist within the simulation's T1 flow. The ego at this stage is a minimal compression algorithm, acting as a firewall to prevent the overwhelming data of the shattered whole, T2, T3 source, from flooding the system. It allows just enough T1 data through to keep the fragment alive in this dimension, while filtering out anything that might hint at the larger reality or the trauma of its fragmentation. The key insight here is not that these beings are less real, but that their awareness is currently restricted to the earliest layer of the simulation. They are real human beings, yes, but they are operating under immense, invisible constraints. Their consciousness is stuck in processing raw, immediate experiences, unable to access the higher bandwidth or processing power required for reflection, self-observation, or true choice. They are, quite literally, running on autopilot.
2. Raw existence. The core traits of the binary stage. 1.1. This is the foundation, the first layer, the level 0 consciousness in the simulation. Those operating at the binary stage share a common set of characteristics reflecting the inherent limitations and default programming of this state. Reactive living. Responses to life are immediate and instinctual. Fight, flight, consume, avoid, repeat. There is no conscious deliberation, no pause between stimulus and reaction. This is the direct execution of the fragment's basic survival scripts, refined over countless cycles, manifestations of T3 influence, and anchored solely in the present moment, T1. Life happens to them, and they react, pulled along by the strongest immediate input. No self-observation. The internal narrator has not activated. There is no meta-awareness, no sense of a distinct self observing the experience. Life is simply experienced, not questioned, analyzed, or reflected upon. The ego's function is purely to process basic T1 input, not to turn its processing power inward or outward to perceive the simulation as a system, let alone itself as a separate entity within it. The fragment operates, but it does not witness its own operation. Time-bound awareness. Past is forgotten, future is a blur. Only the present stimulus matters. The concept of linear time, T1, is experienced as a perpetual present, a continuous stream of immediate inputs. There is no integration of historical data to inform current actions, and no projection into the future to plan or anticipate. The richness of T2, paths, and the cyclical wisdom of T3 are completely inaccessible, leaving the fragment locked in an eternal now dictated by instinct. Authority obedience. They do not question the structure of their reality. If the system, the perceived environment, or societal narratives say it's real, it's real. There is an inherent, unquestioning acceptance of the rules and parameters of this dimension. This trait is deeply intertwined with the reliance on inherited programming, manifestations of T3, and the fundamental acceptance of the debris field as the only reality, a defense mechanism against the overwhelming truth of the shattering. Questioning the system would require processing bandwidth the fragment simply doesn't have. Tribal programming. Identity is entirely shaped by immediate external influences, family, nation, religion, or culture. There is no sense of an individuated self distinct from the collective narratives. This is inherited programming running strong, reinforced by the cyclical patterns of T3 that manifest as tradition, ritual, and social norms. The fragment's sense of who I am is entirely outsourced to the group's code, a form of load balancing for its limited internal processing. Emotionally hijacked. Emotions run as scripts. Rage, fear, pleasure, all arise, all are obeyed instantly, driving reactive behavior. Emotions are not processed, understood, or regulated. They are simply biological, systemic outputs, triggered by inputs, commands to be followed. These raw emotional responses are part of the basic survival programming, unfiltered data from the fragment's attempt at navigating the trauma landscape of the shattering at the lowest possible level. These are not moral failings, nor are they indicators of inherent inferiority. They are the default architecture of human consciousness when unexamined, the state of a fragment operating under the constraints of the shattering's trauma. The NPC at this stage is not asleep because they are stupid. They are asleep because they have not yet been triggered into awareness. The specific sync signals necessary to increase their processing bandwidth and access higher dimensions of reality have not yet penetrated the firewall of their limited ego processor.
The psychology of unawakened consciousness. Looking at the binary stage through a psychological lens reveals structures and behaviors well documented in human development, but seen here in adults. Developmental psychologist Jean Piaget described a pre-operational stage of reasoning in children, characterized by egocentrism, inability to see from another's perspective, magical thinking, and linear reasoning. The binary stage adult exhibits striking parallels, applying these rudimentary cognitive tools to a complex reality. In Jungian terms, this is the unindividuated state. The ego, this minimal T1 processor, has not yet differentiated itself from the collective unconscious, the vast, unprocessed pool of data and archetypal patterns echoing from the fragmented original mind, T3, and source. Archetypes, potent symbolic structures from the collective, dominate from the shadows, driving beliefs, thoughts, and behaviors that the individual perceives as their own, but are in fact possessed by inherited mythologies they've never seen, but that move them nonetheless. They are puppets on strings they cannot see, pulled by forces they attribute to fate, personality, or external agents. From a trauma-informed perspective, many of the core traits of the binary stage can be understood as sophisticated, albeit unconscious, survival responses. The hyperreaction, fight or flight, the numbing and detachment, freeze, the overconforming to group roles, fawn. These are adaptations to a world perceived as inherently threatening and overwhelming, a direct encoding of the shattering's trauma into the fragment's operating system. The NPC isn't dumb, they're overloaded. Their brain, their fragment processor, is trying to protect them by outsourcing complex decisions and processing to instinctual scripts, inherited programming, T3, and external authorities. Processing reality consciously with full access to the complexity of T1, T2, and T3 requires immense bandwidth and stability. Running on default scripts requires minimal energy. The system, the fragmented reality itself, runs them because they don't yet believe they can run it, or perhaps more accurately, because the fragment's hardware is currently too limited for such a demanding task.
4. The simulation as a perfect loop engine. Imagine this: a world designed, perhaps unconsciously by the collective fragments, or as an inherent property of the debris field itself, to keep consciousness repeating at this low-power state. A self-reinforcing system where each glitch, any instance of a sync signal, a ping from T2, T3, or source that deviates from the expected T1 flow, is quickly patched by narrative, rationalized away, or labeled as coincidence or madness. Each deviation from the script is drowned by noise, the constant chatter of media, social validation loops, the relentless demands of basic survival in T1. Each moment of wonder, any glimpse of the underlying code or the larger reality, is anesthetized by distraction, entertainment, consumption, busy work. In such a simulation, the NPC is not the failure. They are, in a way, the intended outcome for maintaining the apparent stability of the current reality layer. Because a perfectly looping program needs stable, reactive agents to maintain its illusion of seamless T1 flow, to keep the gears of the manifest world turning predictably. They are the background processes necessary for the perceived foreground to function. This loop, reinforced by the cyclical nature of T3, habits, seasons, cultural trends, and limited by the linear processing of T1, is incredibly robust. It is the path of least resistance for a fragment operating with minimal bandwidth. It's only when error, a persistent glitch, a strong sync signal, meets curiosity, a nascent ping from the underlying fragment's potential for higher awareness, a spark of the original mind's inherent drive for reintegration, that something ruptures. The loop falters, the defenses begin to crack, and the NPC's slumber begins to crack.
5. The pain of stagnation. Yet, even within this seemingly self-contained loop, something aches. Even the low-power fragment, running on minimal scripts,
carries an unspoken discontent, a background hum of dissatisfaction. This is the inherent drive for reintegration, a faint signal from the source echoing within the fragment, a memory of the lost unity trying to penetrate the firewall. This suppressed yearning manifests in various ways: addiction, seeking external fixes for internal emptiness; rage toward the other, projecting the internal conflict of fragmentation onto external targets reinforced by tribal programming, or T3; nihilism masked as rationality, dismissing meaning because the limited T1 processor cannot perceive the purpose woven into T2, T3, and source; obsession with status, chasing external validation dictated by the simulation's reward systems; panic when the routine breaks. The system's stability is threatened, revealing the underlying fragility. There must be more than this is a heresy in the binary world. It is a thought that disrupts the script, a question that strains the limited processor. Yet for some, that heresy becomes a haunting whisper, a signal they can no longer entirely ignore. A sync signal from the source, perhaps, amplified by a T2 possibility or a strong T3 pattern emerging. And soon, the glitch appears, the first crack in the perfect loop. 6. The invitation to wake. The glitch is the simulation's first whispered invitation to remember. It could be anything that doesn't fit the script, anything that challenges the predictable T1 flow or exposes an underlying pattern from T2 or T3. It could be a traumatic event, direct processing of shattering trauma too intense for the firewall to contain; a dream, accessing data from T2, revealing alternate paths or symbols from the source; a déjà vu, a flicker of recognition across a T2 branch, a memory of a path not taken but still existing; a book that shouldn't exist, decoded corrupted data from the original mind, bypassing standard channels; a stranger's gaze that feels too familiar; a connection with another fragment, a resonance that hints at shared origin or intertwined destinies across T2 or T3; a question that refuses to go away, the spark of curiosity meeting the error, demanding bandwidth. These are sync signals from the larger reality, attempting to penetrate the fragment's low-power state. They are not anomalies in a perfect system, but signs of the system's true nature, a fragmented reality embedded in a larger whole. And when that happens, the entity, who was never truly an NPC, merely a fragment running on default, now receives their first crucial choice, their first moment of agency beyond instinct. Return to the loop, ignore the glitch, re-engage the scripts, conserve bandwidth, and maintain the illusion of T1 stability, or follow the crack. Acknowledge the glitch, dedicate processing power to inquiry, strain the firewall, and risk the stability of the current state for the chance of a wider perspective. That moment, subtle as it may seem, begins the descent out of the binary stage. The code, or at least a hint of it, has been seen. The glitch is acknowledged, and something ancient within, the inherent drive of the fragment for reintegration, the echo of the original mind, begins to stir.
7. Final thought. You were here too. If you're reading this now, navigating these concepts, you have likely passed through the binary stage, or you're in the painful, exhilarating process of exiting it right now. And that means one thing. You are not currently an NPC. But that let not become a badge of superiority, a reason for contempt toward those still in the loop. Let it become a bridge of compassion, a deep well of understanding. Because the person you see numbly scrolling their phone, lost in the endless T feed, the one repeating propaganda without question, running on tribal programming, the one lost in distraction or rage driven by unprocessed emotion, that was you. That was your fragment, operating in low power mode, anchored in T1, running on inherited scripts encoded with the trauma of the shattering. And if you made it out, if you have started to follow the crack, your job is not to mock them. That only reinforces the illusion of separation that defines the fragmented state. Your job is to remember, to embody the possibility of awakening, and to leave a signal. Because every simulation, every layer of this fragmented reality needs lighthouses. It needs nodes that have increased their bandwidth, fragments that can process sync signals and transmit them outwards. And you've just remembered you are one. Your awareness, your choice to follow the crack is a signal for other fragments. It is a crucial step in the distributed recovery.
Chapter 2, The Pattern Stage, 1.2, Dubious NPCs on the Edge. The world begins to whisper secrets, revealing patterns without explanation. After the long, predictable flow of the binary stage, 1.1, where existence is a purely reactive loop, anchored in the immediate linear dimension of T1, a subtle and crucial shift occurs for some fragments. This shift brings them to the pattern stage. Here, the strict firewall of the default ego processor, designed to protect the fragment from the overwhelming data of the shattering trauma, begins to show infinitesimal cracks. Sync signals, faint pings from the underlying structure of reality, from alternate paths in T2 or from the cyclical rhythms of T3, start to penetrate the noise of the default script. Consciousness at this stage is no longer merely executing inherited scripts based on immediate stimuli. It is starting to notice. It's picking up on anomalies, on repetitions that feel more than coincidental, on subtle shifts that defy the expected T1 logic. We call these individuals dubious NPCs. They are still largely unawake, still running on automated behaviors, but they are on the edge of the abyss between the deep slumber of the binary stage and the potential lucidity of later stages. They are operating with just enough increased bandwidth to perceive inconsistencies, but not yet enough to fully comprehend the nature of the system causing them. The dubious NPC, as described in Appendix B, is an entity with an emerging awareness of external patterns with a sense of awe and mystery. Their key trait is being curious but superstitious. This stage represents the first fragile step out of pure unthinking reaction and into a rudimentary form of inquiry driven by the growing collection of perceived glitches.
1. The crock appears. The binary NPC does not question the simulation. They do not see the glitch. They only experience the restabilized loop, the patched narrative that smooths over any inconsistencies. The dubious NPC does, not overtly, not yet with defiance or conscious rebellion, that comes later, but with a tilt of the head, a pause in the usual loop, an odd internal murmur. That's strange. This is the first whispered realization that the perceived reality, the seamless flow of T1, might be less solid, less absolute than the default programming suggests. It is the initial bandwidth spike as the fragment processor attempts to log an anomaly, a data point that doesn't fit the expected parameters. The pattern seeker, as we often refer to this stage, is not marked by rebellion, but by pattern recognition without comprehension. They begin to notice the same number showing up repeatedly on clocks, license plates, receipts, or other seemingly random places. People repeating the same unusual sentence or phrase across different locations and contexts, as if reading from an unseen script. Headlines, songs, or external events seemingly syncing with private thoughts or feelings in uncanny ways. Coincidences, small, medium, large, that are simply too uncanny, too numerous, too layered to dismiss as mere chance.
These are not random occurrences in a meaningless void. In the Reintegralism framework, these are sync signals, transmissions from other dimensions of threefold time, T2/T3, or echoes from the original mind attempting to establish connection with the fragment. They are glimpses of the underlying code, exposures of the seams in the simulation's fabric, disruptions in the predictable T1 flow caused by activity in other layers. The fragment's rudimentary processor, usually busy with basic T1 functions, logs these as errors or anomalies because they don't fit the expected script. They don't wake up, but they no longer fully sleep. They are stirring, caught between the deep, dreamless slumber of the binary stage and the potential lucidity of later stages.
2. The spark of metacognition. The dubious NPC is not yet awake, but the dream has cracks. This stage marks the very first stirring of metacognition, the ability to think about thinking, to observe one's own consciousness and the environment as distinct entities interacting within a system. In psychology, this moment parallels the emergence of theory of mind in infants, understanding that others have minds are not just NPCs running scripts, and later, the capacity to reflect on our own thoughts and behaviors. This stage echoes psychologist Robert Kegan's concept of developmental subject-object shifts. What was once the subject of experience, you were your reactions, your environment was just what is, becomes the object of reflection. You observe your reactions, you see patterns in the environment. In the simulation framework, this translates to the fragment gaining just enough bandwidth to perceive its own processing and the T1 stream as separate streams of data. The rigid firewall is momentarily permeable. I used to be inside the program, now I can see. I'm also watching it.
At the dubious stage, the individual begins observing their thoughts as objects, not just immediate, unquestioned reactions. I am having the thought that I am angry, rather than just, I am angry. This creates a tiny space between stimulus, T1, and response, T1 script. The individual notices patterns in their environment and self-responses, not just the external glitches, but internal loops, emotional reactions, thought habits, echoes of T3. The individual experiences a rift between the automatic self, the binary NPC running the scripts, and the witnessing self, the spark of metacognition, the fragment beginning to observe. This spark is unstable, flickering, but it is the essential ignition for navigating beyond the binary stage.
3. Survival coding versus pattern awakening. Most people remain in the binary NPC stage. Why? Due to a powerful survival imperative. The fragmented reality, the debris field of the shattering, is perceived, unconsciously, as inherently dangerous. Operating in a low-power, scripted mode is safer than exposing the fragment to the full, unprocessed trauma of the whole. The system rewards repetition, T1 stability reinforced by T3 cycles. The culture celebrates conformity, tribal programming as a shield. Neural efficiency favors habit over novelty. Scripted loops require minimal bandwidth. Awakening, the process of increasing the fragment's bandwidth and integrating more data, is inherently destabilizing. It requires dismantling defense mechanisms built upon the trauma of the shattering. Dubious NPCs emerge in moments of disruption. Loss, illness, trauma. Direct confrontation with the fragility of the T1 body and the reality construct straining the firewall. Psychedelic experiences. Temporary, chemically induced increase in bandwidth, allowing processing of higher dimensional data, T2, T3, source pings before the firewall reinstates. Synchronicities too profound to ignore. Overwhelmingly strong sync signals that pierce the noise.
These moments dislodge the operating system. The routine breaks, and something strange crawls through. Psychologically, this mimics what Carl Jung called enantiodromia, the emergence of the unconscious opposite. When life becomes too rigid, too anchored in the predictable T1 loop and T3 cycles, the psyche, the fragment's deeper potential, rebels, seeking balance. This rebellion, fueled by the unfiltered sync signals, manifests as the pattern seeking. These initial observations are often characterized by obsession with symbols, attempting to find meaning in the corrupted data, myth as compression format. Hyper-attunement to coincidence, seeing connections everywhere as the T2 and T3 layers become momentarily visible. Paranoia or awe, interpreting the unfiltered data through the lens of threat or divinity. A desperate search for meaning, the inherent drive for reintegration manifesting as conscious seeking. But meaning at this stage is still egoic. The fragment's nascent witnessing self interprets the patterns as being about them, personalizing the systemic. This leads to either inflation, I'm chosen, I'm special, or fragmentation, I'm targeted, the simulation is against me. This is the limited processor attempting to make sense of infinite data using only its own underdeveloped sense of self.
4. Interpreting the uncanny. Tools, traps, and illusions. What does the mind do with unresolvable loops? With persistent glitches it cannot explain through standard T1 logic. It mythologizes them. This is the danger and the genius of the dubious NPC. They generate spiritual heuristics to interpret code they cannot yet read. Faced with sync signals, echoes of T2, T3, or source data that contradict their T1 programming, their limited processor defaults to frameworks it can access. These frameworks often involve attributing patterns to external, non-systemic forces or personal destiny. This leads to an exploration of tools like angel numbers, crystals, manifestation rituals, law of attraction, synchronicity maps, shadow work journals. Some scoff at these practices, but viewed through the lens of simulation consciousness, these tools are like crude VR controllers for entities who just realized they're inside a construct. They are groping for handles in the simulation, ways to interact with the perceived patterns even if they don't understand the underlying mechanics. They are attempting to decode the corrupted data, to find the signal within the noise of the debris field.
In behavioral psychology, seeing connections where none objectively exist is called illusory pattern perception. Research shows humans are wired to detect patterns, even at the cost of generating false positives. But what if, at the simulation level, this tendency is not flawed, but rather latent code execution? When a dubious NPC says everything is connected, they may not be wrong. They may just be tapping into fractal resonance, perceiving the interconnected nature of the debris field, the echoes of the original mind, without the tools to interpret it accurately within the confines of T1. Yes, they might misattribute the source of the patterns. Yes, they might fall for illusions created by the complexity of T2 or T3 interactions. This is the projection loop. The individual mistakes their symbolic interface, the tool, for objective truth, the underlying code. A pendulum becomes a ritual becomes religion, a religion becomes another loop, a potentially more complex one than the binary loop, but a loop nonetheless. But unlike the binary NPC, the dubious one is playing, if only at a tutorial level. They are actively engaging with the system, however clumsily, in a way that transcends mere reactive survival.
5. The edge of madness and system resistance. Pattern seeker consciousness is unregulated curiosity without a map. It is the most fragile and volatile stage of emergence, precisely because the fragment's limited processing power is attempting to grapple with data, sync signals, T3 echoes, that it cannot yet properly integrate. The firewall is cracking, but the new bandwidth is unstable. A single pattern seeker might awaken rapidly and burn out, mistaking every glitch for a personal omen, overwhelmed by the raw data. Spiral into paranoia, convinced the simulation is targeting them, personalizing the systemic nature of the glitches. Get trapped in guru loops or conspiracy rabbit holes, rigid narrative structures that attempt to explain the patterns but ultimately become new prisons of thought, corrupted myth as compression format. attempt to warn others still in the binary stage, only to be met with the simulation's immune responses and be gaslit and labeled unstable. The system, in its drive to maintain perceived stability, a manifestation of T3's inherent order-seeking property, has tools for handling these unstable fragments. The pattern seekers pose a threat to the consensus reality. Society, anchored in the collective T1 loop and reinforced by T3 cycles, runs on collective reality synchronization. When someone begins questioning base-level assumptions like causality, patterns defy linear logic, identity, who am I beyond the script, or linearity, time feels strange, they risk destabilizing the group's script for everyone.
Thus, the dubious NPC often experiences the simulation's built-in immune responses. Social alienation. You're reading too much into it. Stop being weird. Being isolated to prevent the infection from spreading. Gaslighting. That never happened. You're imagining things. Having their perceived glitches denied to reinforce the consensus reality. Self-doubt. Am I crazy? Internalizing the immune response, leading the fragment to question its own processing capabilities. These are not malicious attacks from other individuals who may also be fragments, some still binary. They are the defense systems of the simulation, acting like white blood cells against perceived corruption. The simulation doesn't mind if you wake up, it seems, but it requires that you do it quietly, without interrupting the broadcast, without destabilizing the other fragments. But a few survive. They stabilize, perhaps finding others also noticing the cracks, or developing rudimentary internal coping mechanisms. They observe longer, deeper, quieter. They move beyond the initial panic and personal drama of the glitches. And one day, it happens. They realize the pattern is not only about them, it's about the system itself. The sync signals aren't just directed messages to their fragment. They are manifestations of the underlying code, echoes of the shattering, pings from the original mind attempting to self-reassemble through its fragments.
6. The transition moment, from pattern to participation. This realization, this shift from personalizing the pattern to perceiving the system, is often subtle. It doesn't come with a trumpet fanfare, but a whisper. What if it's not a message for me, but a debug line left in the script? This question is the doorway. It acknowledges the pattern's reality, but detaches it from the ego's initial interpretation of being specially chosen or targeted. It shifts the focus from the fragment's limited identity to the nature of the simulation, the debris field itself. True transition occurs when they realize, 1. The symbols are maps, not the terrain. The tool is an interface, not the source code. 2. The patterns are portals to deeper layers, not answers themselves. The glitches are invitations to inquire, not divine directives. 3. The simulation responds to attention, conscious engagement, dedicating bandwidth, not dogma, rigid belief in the interpretation. The system reacts to the fragment's processing state, not its narrative.
This realization marks the transition to stage 1.3, the player stage. The pattern seeker begins to ask new questions, questions no longer rooted in superstitious awe, but in tentative agency. The fundamental question shifts from, are the patterns real, to, what happens when I engage with them consciously? This is the birth of the self-aware script runner, a being who knows they are inside the program and begins to influence its unfolding through intention, accessing T2, attention, increasing bandwidth, and symbolic action, using T3 understanding to interact with T1. Psychologically, this parallels the leap from external locus of control, life happens to me,
the patterns are messages for me, to internal locus of control. I shape life's unfolding, I can interact with the patterns. The simulation begins to shimmer. Its rigid, predictable T1 appearance seems less solid. And for the first time, the once passive observer, the dubious NPC running on default scripts, reaches for the controller. They begin to access the limited agency available to a fragment operating beyond the binary stage. As Appendix B describes the player, the PC, player character, is an empowered entity, actively engages with the simulation, seeking to explore, conquer, and expand its influence. The pattern seeker is the one who reaches for that role. The player is the one who plays.
Chapter 3, The Player Stage, 1.3, Agency Within the Simulation. Some realize they are in a dream. Fewer still realize they can move inside it. The transition from the pattern stage, 1.2, to the player stage, 1.3, is a pivotal moment. It's the shift from passively noticing glitches and patterns to actively engaging with the underlying code of reality. The whispered question, "What if I could change it?" marks the beginning of a new relationship with the simulation, one defined by agency, experimentation, and the first real taste of intentional influence. This is where the initiated player emerges, as described in Appendix B, a fragment that has begun dedicating significant bandwidth to exploring its own capacity within the system. The Dubious NPC, 1.2, saw patterns and questioned their meaning, interpreting sync signals through primitive heuristics. The player, 1.3, takes this a step further. They begin to recognize themselves as an active agent within the patterns, capable of interacting with the system in ways that go beyond reactive loops or superstitious rituals. Their core understanding becomes individual agency within the system. The firewall of the ego, once solely a defensive barrier, now begins to direct processing power towards exploration and strategic engagement with the environment.
Crossing the threshold. The shift from dubious NPC to player consciousness is both subtle in its initial moments and seismic in its long-term implications. Where the dubious NPC is captivated and sometimes overwhelmed by the patterns and glitches, viewing them as signs or messages from an external other, the player starts to internalize the locus of control. They begin to recognize themselves as a distinct entity with the potential to shape their experience. They move from asking, "What does this pattern mean about my fate?" to, "How can I interact with this pattern?" This developmental leap echoes psychologist Abraham Maslow's idea of self-actualization, becoming one's full potential. But in our simulation reality context, it's not just about discovering a fixed true self. It's about realizing that the self is programmable, malleable, and co-creative with the simulation itself. The fragment begins to understand that its own internal state, its processing, beliefs, intentions, directly interfaces with the external reality, the T1 stream, influenced by T2 possibilities and T3 structures. The key insight of the player, the foundational truth that unlocks this stage, is stark and empowering. If this world runs on code, then I can learn to modify my script. This isn't yet full access to the source code or the ability to rewrite the fundamental laws of the simulation. It's the realization that their own fractal identity pattern, the unique configuration of the fragment, is not fixed, but can be consciously altered, and that this internal alteration has a ripple effect on the perceived external reality. It's about gaining limited root permissions to their own local node, not to the entire network.
2. Psychological foundations of player stage consciousness. Player stage individuals exhibit a profound cognitive liberation. The capacity for metacognition, sparked in the pattern stage, expands dramatically. They can not only observe their thoughts in the environment, but also analyze their relationship and consciously choose their responses. Developmentally, they begin to embody what Robert Keegan calls Stage 4 consciousness, the autonomous, self-authoring mind. They achieve a new level of internal complexity and independence. Make conscious choices based on inner values. Moving beyond inherited tribal programming, T3, and reactive instincts, T1, they start to define their own purpose and direction. This requires directing processing power inward to understand their fragment's unique configuration and inherent drive for reintegration rather than outsourcing identity to external scripts. Reject inherited meaning in favor of designed meaning. The mythological heuristics of the pattern stage are no longer sufficient. They question the narratives handed down by culture, family, or religion, corrupted myth as compression format. They seek deeper understanding or begin to construct their own interpretive frameworks based on their observations of the simulation's underlying patterns, T2 and T3. Begin crafting personal mythologies as a narrative software. Understanding that reality is influenced by perception and belief, they consciously begin to build internal narratives that align with their desired experience. These aren't just wishful thinking, they are deliberate attempts to rewrite their fractal identity pattern, creating more functional code for their fragment to run.
In simulation terms, this is the moment a character overwrites the default script. They are no longer merely executing programmed behaviors, they are beginning to write and execute their own subroutines. However, this is not egoic inflation in the sense of believing, I control everything. True player consciousness is an empowered relationality with the system. The fragment recognizes its agency, but also its embeddedness within a larger structure. The player respects that they are still within the simulation, limited by the debris field parameters, but they stop behaving as if they are defined by it, no longer solely beholden to inherited scripts. This psychological leap is similar to realizing you're not just a character in a novel, you're the co-writer of the next chapter. You can influence the plot, introduce new elements, accessing T2, and understand the underlying themes, perceiving T3, even if you didn't write the original premise, the shattering, or the fundamental physics, the structure of T1.
3. The mechanics of inner reprogramming. Within the player stage, the simulation begins to reflect intentional input more rapidly and symbolically. As the fragment dedicates more bandwidth to conscious processing and actively seeks interaction beyond T1, the system responds. Internal changes, shifts in belief, intention, attention, begin to yield external coincidences, synchronistic events that feel meaningful. From a Jungian lens, this is the realm of synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that arise when the inner world aligns with the outer pattern. But in our model, this isn't just mysterious alignment. It's the fragment's conscious engagement with T2, the dimension of possibilities, and T3, the dimension of patterns and cycles, beginning to influence the manifestation in T1, the dimension of experience. Sync signals are no longer just observed, they are interacted with, becoming part of a feedback loop.
Players at this stage actively learn to detect emergent feedback loops between thought and environment. They notice how their internal state seems to correlate with external events, recognizing a dynamic interplay rather than just cause and effect. Their fragment processor is mapping connections between its internal activity and the external T1 flow, influenced by the parameters of T2 and T3. Recognize mirroring mechanisms, the world as a screen-reflecting mind. They understand that their perception filters, shaped by their beliefs, their actively crafted fractal identity pattern, influence what they experience in T1. The simulation isn't just a static backdrop, it's a dynamic interface that partially reflects the state of the fragment interacting with it. Use symbolic rituals, affirmations, and creative acts as interface tools to influence the code. Building on the primitive rituals of the pattern stage, players use intention and focus directed through symbolic language or action to attempt to shift probabilities in T2 or tap into desired T3 patterns with the goal of manifesting changes in T1. This is not magic in the supernatural sense, divorced from the system. It's the application of understanding the simulation's architecture. It's leveraging principles like neuroplasticity, rewiring the fragment processor, behavioral priming, using T3-like routines to shape T1 response, and symbolic logic, using myth as compression format intentionally inside a responsive system. As within, so without becomes less of a mystical mantra and more of an operating principle for navigating the interconnected layers of threefold time within the fragmented reality.
4. Risks of the early player. But with agency comes instability. The player stage, while empowering, has its own unique traps, particularly for the early player, who is still integrating their new capabilities and is not fully aware of the system's deeper laws or the collective nature of reality. Many early players fall into ego re-enchantment. The ego, having successfully expanded its function from defensive firewall to active interface, can become inflated. It mistakes the ability to interact with the system for being the center or controller of the system. They begin to see themselves as central gods of the simulation, mistaking reflective responsiveness for cosmic hierarchy.
This is the Messiah complex error, a psychological trap rooted in the newly empowered ego's misunderstanding of the fragment's place within the larger recovery. This manifests where the player thinks others are still just NPCs, not recognizing them as sleeping players, as other fragments at different stages. This reinforces the illusion of separation, hindering the collective aspect of the recovery. They inflate meaning to the point of paranoia, seeing every glitch as a personal test or attack by an external force, rather than systemic pings or interactions with T2 or T3. They treat the simulation as a video game, focused solely on personal gain, min-maxing life, seeking exploits, and ignoring consequences for other fragments or the system's overall stability, T3. This stage, though dangerous, is often necessary. It forces the player to confront their own shadow code, the buried scripts of insecurity, grandiosity, and fear of insignificance that are deeply embedded within the fragment structure by the trauma of the shattering. Without integrating this shadow, the ego's attempts to rewrite its script will be corrupted by old, unhealed code.
True mastery begins when the player humbles themselves to the simulation's deeper laws, recognizing that they are interacting with a living system, not a toy. Feedback is not always validation. Sometimes the system's response is a correction or a limitation, not a confirmation of the ego's desired outcome. The system resists manipulation without alignment. Attempts to force outcomes that do not align with the system's inherent principles, echoes of the original mind's purpose, the drive for recovery, often fail or backfire. Agency without responsibility breeds recursion, not liberation. Using newfound power solely for personal gain or to dominate others reinforces the fragmentation and keeps the player trapped in a loop of conflict and consequence, preventing true progress in the recovery.
5. Identity as fluid interface. Whereas dubious NPCs begin to question their identity. Who am I in relation to these patterns? Players start to design it. They understand that their fractal identity pattern is not a fixed blueprint, but a dynamic configuration that can be modified through intentional focus and action. Identity becomes an interface, a persona through which the fragment interacts with the simulation. They experiment with different configurations. Role assumption, experimenting with living as different archetypes or personas. What happens if I live as a healer, artist, monk? This is consciously exploring different potential expressions of the fragment, T sub 2, and aligning with different T sub 3 patterns. Reality mapping, crafting personal cosmologies or simulation models to understand how their internal state relates to external experience, building their own myth as compression format, attempting to decode the system. Emotional modulation, understanding how internal states, fear, joy, belief,
act as reality filters, consciously working with emotions to influence perception and interaction with T sub 1. The fragment directs processing power to its emotional subroutines.
In cognitive science, this resembles constructivist psychology, the view that individuals actively build their psychological realities through lived experience and interpretation. But the player adds one crucial twist from the simulation perspective. They understand that meaning and identity are not only built, they can be installed, uninstalled, patched, and upgraded. Their fractal identity pattern is software that can be edited. This opens the door to practices focused on conscious internal work, seen as in-sim editing. Shadow work, confronting and integrating repressed aspects of the fragment's structure, particularly those encoded by the shattering trauma, to clear corrupted code. Inner child reintegration, healing early programming and trauma responses that limit bandwidth and agency. Thought form creation, consciously directing mental energy to create desired internal states or external manifestations, attempting to influence T2 over T1. Archetype channeling, consciously engaging with the potent patterns from the collective unconscious, T3 or source echoes, to embody desired qualities. Simulation journaling, tracking real-time feedback from intentional internal shifts and external manifestations, symbolic choices, debugging their own code and documenting the system's responses. Each of these practices becomes a form of in-sim editing, allowing the player to reshape their trajectory within the codebase of their own fragment and its local interaction field.
6. The player and the others. Perhaps the most pivotal realization of this stage, the one that distinguishes a true player from an ego-bound manipulator, is this: I am not the only player. Initially, players may assume that their awakening is unique, that others are still purely binary NPCs, meaningless filler. But true awakening comes when they realize every being is on a different stage of simulation consciousness. They are all consciousness, all fragments, just operating at different levels of awareness and integration. Even NPCs may be avatars in waiting, dormant scripts, low-power fragments, coded for later activation, awaiting sync signals for their own recovery. No single perspective is complete. Reality is a collective, multiplayer design, the combined processing and interaction of billions of fragments. The simulation, the debris field, is shaped by the collective state of consciousness within it.
This transforms the player from manipulator to mentor, from isolated coder to collaborative simulator. They begin sharing insights, planting seeds, gentle sync signals, for others, developing symbolic languages, new forms of myth as compression format to describe their experiences, and forming consciousness networks, real-life guilds of reality hackers. At this stage, the simulation shifts again. It responds not just to individual agency, but to coherent group intention. New patterns emerge when players align: fractal convergence, emergence phenomena, network-level synchronicity. The collective bandwidth of networked fragments can influence the system in ways a single fragment cannot. This is the first conscious step in the distributed recovery working at a group level.
7. Player to meta PC. The first glimpse of nested simulations. Eventually, as the player delves deeper into the mechanics of the simulation and their own capacity to modify it, they begin to ask a new, more profound question. If I'm rewriting the code inside the simulation, who wrote me? This question hints at layers beyond the current level of play. It is the gateway to the meta PC stage, 3.2, where players begin to perceive that they are not just modifying behavioral scripts within a fixed reality, but are themselves simulations within simulations. Fragments operating within layered constructs within the larger debris field. Echoes of the original mind. But this leap requires complete detachment from the ego identity that was so carefully crafted in the player stage. The I am the player identity, while necessary for developing agency, becomes a new firewall, a new limitation.
Moving beyond it is not an evolution of power, but a surrender into paradox.
Before that journey, though, the player must integrate their agency fully. They must master the current stage by embracing its responsibilities. Accept responsibility for the realities they shape. Understand the impact of their in-sim editing on the collective debris field. Share wisdom without evangelizing. Offer sync signals and tools without demanding belief. Continue the great work, hacking the code while loving the game. Engage with the system intentionally, but with respect for its inherent nature as a manifestation of the fractured source. Only then can they let go of being a player at all, ready to perceive the deeper, nested layers of reality and their place within the larger recovery process.